So Elliot comes to us as a Marine who spent 8 years on active duty. In that 8 years, he was deployed 5 times to combat. Elliot was in the second battle for Fallujah in 2004. He was wounded there and earned a Purple Heart as well as a Silver Star Medal for gallantry. Following his time in Fallujah, he was deployed back stateside, and his battalion, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, was involved in relief efforts after Hurricane Katrina. So he went right from full-on combat to humanitarian assistance and disaster response within the continental U.S. And then he redeployed again after he had joined MARSOC, the Marine Special Operations Command, which was a new entity at the time, and he deployed back to Afghanistan, and he spent a tour as an advisor for a 700-man Afghan commando battalion. In between, also, he spent some time as one of the Marines dispatched to the Central Intelligence Agency that we have working paramilitary operations there, which there are not many Marines that do that. So he has had a very unique and action-packed career as a Marine.
Thank you all for having me at the Marine Memorial Club. I've been on tour for a little while now, but it's nice to feel like you're coming home a little bit. So I thought I'd just start by reading a brief passage so you can get a feel for the book, and then I'll talk about it. So this is the opening. Many would call me a dishonest man, but I've always kept faith with myself. There is an honesty in that, I think. I am Ali's brother. We are from a village that no longer exists, and our family was not large or prosperous. The war that came after the Russians, but before the Americans, killed our parents. Of them, I have only dim memories. There is my father's Kalashnikov hidden in a woodpile by the door, him cleaning it, working oiled rags on its parts, and the smell of gunmetal, and feeling safe. There is my mother's secret, the one she shared with me. Once a month, she'd count out my father's earnings from fighting in the mountains or farming. She'd send me and Ali from our village, Sperkai, to the large bazaar in Orgun, a 2-day walk. The Orgun bazaar sold everything, fine cooking oils and spices, candles to light our home, and fabrics to repair our clothes. My mother always entrusted me with a special purchase. Before we left, she would press an extra coin in my hand, one she'd stolen from my father. Among the crowded stalls of the bazaar, I would slip away from my brother's watchful eye and buy her a pack of cigarettes, a vice forbidden to a woman. When we returned home, I would place the pack in her hiding spot, the birchwood cradle where she'd rocked Ali and me as infants. Our mud-walled house was small, 2 thatch-roofed rooms with a courtyard between them. The cradle was kept in the room I shared with Ali. My mother would never get rid of the cradle. It was the one thing that was truly hers. At night, after we returned from the bazaar, she'd sneak into our room, her small, sandaled feet gliding across the carpets that lined the dirt floor. Her hand would cup a candle, its smothered light casting shadows on her young face, aging her. Her eyes, one brown and the other green, a miracle or defect of birth, shifted about the room. Carefully, she would lean over the cradle as she'd done before taking us to nurse. She would run her fingers between the blankets that once swaddled my brother and me. And, finding the pack I'd left her, she'd step into the courtyard, and I'd fall back asleep to the faint smell of her tobacco just past my door. This secret made me feel close to my mother. In the years since, I've wondered why she entrusted me with it. At times, I've thought it was because I was her favorite, but this isn't why. The truth is, she recognized in me her own ability to deceive. So that's the opening passage of the novel in the voice of its protagonist, a young Afghan named Aziz. It's difficult anytime you're sort of thinking particularly, about a story. Where does it begin, as an author? Because so much of the process of writing a novel is you're sort of groping in the dark to figure out exactly what it is you're trying to say and what your characters are trying to say. And, this book obviously is written from the perspective of an Afghan. And my experience in Afghanistan, it was a little different in so much as the entire time I was serving there, going in and out between 2008 and 2011, I worked exclusively as an advisor to Afghan troops. So as much as, many of my war buddies were, the other Marines and service members I fought alongside, they were often, in significant respect, the other Afghans, the ones I advised. And we did all the things fighting men have always done together. We fought together, we bled together, we mourned friends together. But upon coming home, I knew I would never see any of these Afghans again, sort of trapped as they were in their country's elliptical war. So these weren't a bunch of guys I could keep up with on Facebook, call long distance or go get like quarter beers with at the local VFW. So in writing a book from their perspective, I realized, I wanted to render the war as best I could, how I think that they might have seen it. And for me, I think it was also a process of sort of reckoning with a loss and trying to tell their story and what was a last act of friendship. But to kind of come back to that idea, where does the story start? As I've sort of groped around looking for what were the essential threads of Aziz's story, there are anecdotes that I would keep coming back to, just flashes of my experience. One in particular that I just like to share with you all. One of the guys I advised was a fellow named Isak, Commander Isak, and I worked with him in Paktika province in southeastern Afghanistan, right along the border with Pakistan's South Waziristan province, a very remote and violent place. And so sort of the rhythm of me and Isak's work together was about every 2 weeks we would have what I guess you might grandly call our operational planning meeting, which really involved me walking across a fire base that was about 2 football fields in diameter to the little wooden shack that was Isak's hooch. And I'd come through the door and I'd flop down on sort of the one lumpy old sofa he had in the corner. He had a little plywood coffee table in front of him, and he'd sit down next to me after rifling through his things, and on the table he'd sort of put down a pack of smokes, a pot of chai, and the two of us would gaze at the far wall. And sitting on the far wall were just 2 things, a map and a calendar. So I'd sit there and I'd say, all right, Isak, sit down, time for our operational planning meeting. What are you thinking, next couple weeks? What's your take on where we should go? Isak was a Tajik guy, been fighting in that part of Afghanistan for a decade. He knew the ground better than anybody. So, Isak would sort of, cigarette in hand, step to the map, stroke his beard, and look, and inevitably he would pick one of the villages right on the border and say, Mr. Elliot, it's like, we could go up to Rarakare. There's always very good hunting in Rarakare. I'd say, all right, Rarakare sounds good. We'd block out 4 or 5 days on our patrol schedule, get the trucks gassed up, load the guys up in them, and maybe take a 12-vehicle convoy out there, 100+ Afghans. And, over and under 50-50 chance that, you get some type of contact when you're up in Rarakare. We would come back after a few days, have one day to do maintenance on the trucks, another day, give the guys a day off for another day. And inevitably, I would sort of be walking back across the fire base for the operational planning meeting, open the door to Isak's hooch, flop down on the lumpy sofa, pack of smokes, pot of chai, the 2 of us staring at the map and the calendar 2 weeks later. And I go, all right, Isak, great op in Rarakare. What are you thinking about next? And he'd come up to the map, cigarette in hand, stroking his chin, and he'd sort of go to the next village down and say, Mr. Elliot, it's always good hunting in Mangrate. We could go to Mangrate. And I'd say, all right, let's go up to Mangrate. Same thing, we drive up there, 50-50 chance we would take contact, and we would come back down. The war, Isak was a guy who held all of his station and his position in this sort of militia unit. He had many members of his tribe and his extended family who were in his employ there. He was incented to be in that position. He had more in common with a beat cop than he had with, a General Eisenhower figure, a leader of campaigns. The conversation between us was never, Mr. Elliot, if we go to Mangrate, then we hit them in Rarakare. We can go 1 village south to Malikshe, push them across the border, shut that door, war will be over, I can go back to my crops, you can go get your Master of Fine Arts and write that novel you've been talking about. It just wasn't that type of war. So what type of war was it? And in many respects, the ambition of the book was to try to render a paradigm really at the local level that I saw playing out again and again, and to try to show that type of war that didn't necessarily fit with what are the more traditional conceptions of war. So what I'd like to do right now is read just a short passage of the book that kind of gets at some of those themes. So Aziz's story, as we just heard when the novel opens up, it's him talking about his mother. Well, in the pages that follow, his mother and father are killed basically in the years between the Soviet occupation and the American invasion in 2001. And he and his brother go to Orgun, a small city near their home, where they kind of scrape by for a few years, working as basically delivery boys in a marketplace. And then Aziz's brother, his older brother, who's been taking care of him, is grievously wounded and winds up in the hospital. And while Aziz is trying to figure out how he's going to take care of his brother in the hospital, he gets recruited by a fellow named Commander Sabir to go fight in what's called the Special Lashkar being Pashto for militia. And the deal is that if Aziz serves in this militia, his wages will go to keeping his brother in the hospital. And with that opening, Aziz sort of gets sucked into the quagmire of fighting on the border in a war that in many respects he comes to learn is being fought for every reason but the ending of it. So this scene I'd like to just read from is a little bit later. Commander Sabir is wanting to build an outpost in a certain village, and to do so he has Aziz go serve as an informant in that village, and he lives with a man named Mumtaz. And Mumtaz was an old Mujahideen fighter against the Soviets who has since sort of renounced violence in the war. And this is Mumtaz telling his story to Aziz. "When my brother died," he said, "it was not in the war we thought we fought. We were Mujahideen and treated as heroes in this village, our battlefield achievements known by all, earning us honor we became greedy for. This led to larger and more daring attacks. When the fighting slowed each winter, we'd grow impatient for it. The Russians stayed on their bases, and it was difficult to strike at them. An informant of ours in Orgun, a man who, like our father, ran a trucking company, told us how in a few nights a Russian convoy would pass our village along the North Road. Eager as we were, my brother and I asked few questions. The operation would be simple. After curfew, we'd bury a mine in the road, and in the morning, if the Russians didn't show up, we'd remove it. Some days later, in the darkness, my brother and I chipped a ditch out of the frozen earth and slid the mine in. We carefully repacked the crumbled soil and went home, giving the matter little thought, as if we'd planted a tree and casually wondered if it'd grow. We slept soundly, and early the following morning, before the sun rose, we returned to either inspect our kill or to recover the mine. As we walked through the clear, cold air, the snow on the distant hilltops glowed with firelight. The mine had struck, and we approached the road riding on great gusts of enthusiasm. But still our situation was uncertain. Who knew if the Russians had sent anyone to aid their convoy? Who knew if we'd come across any manic survivors? These were uncertainties we felt prepared for. We weren't prepared for what we found. As we crested a last ridge and glimpsed our kill, we saw only the beginning of our terrible mistake. Tilted against its side as if the carcass of a great steel beast was the truck, but it wasn't Russian. It was civilian and full of lumber that now burned in a pyre sparkling on the snow. We kept our distance, but were close enough to feel the fire on our faces. We could see the cab and its white paint, which curled to scales against the heat, and then the steel beneath the paint that scorched to rust. Behind a shattered windshield, flames licked out an upright silhouette that burned with the dignity of one who met death immediately, without pain and shock, and through this absence seemed strangely alive. I can't say how long we watched the pyre. When we left, the sun still hadn't risen, but the silhouette had been consumed. On our journey home, we said nothing and tried to hide in our silence. News of the attacks spread through all the families of Gomal. The truck had been from our informant's company, and the dead driver had been his employee. Several days later, my father and our village's Spengaris were called to a jirga in Orgun to settle the matter. The deliberations were short, lasting but 2 days, and my father returned in ruin. The Spengaris on both sides decreed that our father was responsible for our actions and that he must replace the destroyed truck and buy yet another to recoup the damaged cargo. In this, our informant made out very well, for the first truck forced us to sell our home, and the second wiped out my father's accounts, eliminating him as a business competitor. And that's when we moved here. So that's sort of Mumtaz's story. The idea that he basically, as a mujahideen, gets duped into a business scam and plants a mine on the road that ultimately leads his father, who is a competitor, to ruin. And a lot of these themes that come up in the novel were ones I saw frequently in Afghanistan. For instance, in the Korangal Valley, a place that was made famous by Sebastian Junger's film Restrepo, and where some of the hardest fighting of the war took place. The rapid deterioration of security conditions in that particular valley in Kunar province, was actually directly tied not to the Taliban or anything of that nature, but to a lumber dispute, where in the early 2000s, the Americans were leveraged by a fellow named Mullah Mateen to basically launch a raid against his competitor. And frequently, working in special operations and even as an infantryman when I served in Iraq, you could always feel the pull of local politics, basically trying to get you sucked into what was the economy of that conflict. And when I say economy, I don't necessarily mean it in a financial way, although there are certainly financial incentives. But wars have economies in so much as people behave according to their incentive structures. So if we go back to Commander Isak, who I was speaking about before, Isak had no incentive for the war to end. If the war ended, frankly, it wouldn't be good for him, because he would go from being the head of a very important militia unit in southeastern Afghanistan to basically a local sharecropper, which is what he was before the war. So, when I would start asking myself, what type of war is it? I had to have a long examination of these economies that existed in Afghanistan, and in many respects, I kept that country fighting for 30 years. But then if I wanted to be honest and take a really hard look at myself, at what I was engaged in, I could see these economies also sprouting up around my service. Why did I keep coming back? What was that drive? And I think many of those drivers were the ones that we've always seen. You're going because your buddies are still going, because the war isn't ending, because there's always one more deployment to do. But it was also the idea of those deployments, those combat deployments, help my advancement. And there aren't any answers in this book, but I think that story and fiction is a great place to frame questions. And I think after 15 years of war, it's worthwhile to start asking those questions: is how is it and why are we able to be at war for 15 years? And so that's something that the story tries to lay out. I think something else with the book, as I talked a little bit about, kind of one is groping in the dark with the story, not really knowing what it is. I didn't set out initially or intend to write a book that was all told in the first-person perspective of an Afghan. That was sort of a realization I came to in the writing of it. So for me, particularly later in my career when I worked in intelligence, so much of my job was debriefing Afghans, sort of dealing with the walk-ins that would come into our fire base, or people we had more formal relationships with. And those walk-ins, the cadence of that was inevitably, I could almost set my watch to it. If I ordered up a short stack of pancakes with, hash browns and sausage, like that, there would be an Afghan at the gate who wanted to talk to me, and I'd have to push it aside. Or, inevitably in the shower, an Afghan would show up. It was never good timing for me. But those exchanges would always be me on one side of a desk, an Afghan on the other, that Afghan with a story that he was convinced was important, and my job to extract that story from him and determine its worth. And so the rhythm of the novel in its early drafts actually was told in that cadence, where Aziz has walked into a firebase and he's telling his story to an American. Sort of in the same framework of like Conrad's The Heart of Darkness, where the novella opens and Marlowe is sitting on a boat in the Thames River in London telling his story about going upriver in the Congo to go visit Kurtz. But as I started writing the book, the frame never felt right. This American character that Aziz was telling his story to just wasn't holding up. And I had to start asking myself, why did I paint this American in there? Why do I feel afraid to have Aziz speak directly to the reader? And as I sort of was thinking on that, I kind of came to the realization that I built this American in as a crutch. And if my intention for the novel was to try to tell the story of the Afghans that I had served alongside, I sort of had to find the artistic courage to just remove that crutch and allow the novel to succeed or fail based off the merits of Aziz's voice alone. And that's the conclusion I came to. And the end product is, it's what we have here. So again, it's been a journey, and the novel in its whole is an examination of those many themes I mentioned. With that, I'd like to just read you one last passage and then maybe open it up for questions and discussion. And this last passage is when Aziz goes to live with Mumtaz in this village. These are his observations of what that village looks like in the war. The night was cold, and all through it I got up, stepped lightly over Mumtaz, and fed dried branches into the mouth of the stove. Once the last scrap burned out in the fire, a chill set into my legs and woke me. I walked into the compound's dirt courtyard to wait for the dawn. As the early light came, I saw how poor Mumtaz was. His home was nothing more than the small coop, the mud room we slept in, and the four walls of the courtyard. A ditch ran beneath one of the walls and out the back. Dishes were stacked alongside it. This was the kitchen. Past Mumtaz's compound were the mountains. Though it seemed these never ended, they were not enough to protect the village from the war. But they were enough to preserve it and its traditions. And, even as isolated as the village was, sprouts of progress had arrived. Motorbikes, cell phones, and a few homemade satellite dishes that perched from rooftops, all standing as messengers from other, more modern worlds. But it was a false progress. It measured not movement forward, but the distance we would soon travel backward when the war destroyed everything. So, thank you. The Marine Corps has as we know, a long and storied history of fighting small wars, and I think it's sort of in the organization's institutional DNA, as well as it is with Army Special Forces. And, the current structure of MARSOC with the Marine Special Operations Team, the construct is very similar to what a Special Forces Operational Detachment Alpha looks like. So I'll only speak to my experience. The Marines I served alongside, I was a MSOT team leader as a captain. We're excellent, and they understood FID, were incredibly competent at it. When I was an advisor to a commando battalion, it was a 2-team mission across the country, so there were 2 teams assigned to each battalion. So it was my team, and we had a sister ODA that we worked with. And we had a fantastic relationship, and everyone worked together really, really well. So I think Marines understand it. They know how to do it. I think one of the challenges that we've seen in Afghanistan, and this is one of the challenges inherent with any type of counterinsurgency, it goes back to sort of famous words. I don't know if you've ever read Mike Sheehan's book, A Bright Shining Lie, about Vietnam, which talks about John Paul Vann, who was a State Department officer who spent, I believe, just 12 solid years there. He said, the problem with the Vietnam War wasn't that we fought a 7-year war, it's that we fought 7 one-year wars. So I think, those 8-month, year-long deployments, you have guys who, give all you could give in an 8-month or year-long deployment. But as I always saw, too, the Afghans knew the game. The Taliban had the saying, you all might have the watches, but we got the time. And that's true. And they would see the rotations, and they understood that. So that, in terms of manpower, I think was a challenge, and I don't think there is an appetite to send Marines to Afghanistan for 5 years or for the duration of the conflict. So that's something that hamstrings you. But in terms of professionalism, Marines' ability to do forward internal defense as well as someone in Army Special Forces, absolutely. One of the things that was very interesting for me working in Afghanistan was I worked both with the Afghan National Army and then later when I was a paramilitary officer with certain units that were basically CIA-funded units. And one of the difference was those units were worked for the U.S. government and were not under the Afghan National Army construct. So the ANA construct was, which makes sense, we sort of made them in our image. This is a national army for the nation of Afghanistan. People were recruited from all over the country. So if you were in Helmand province, you might have soldiers from Mazar-e-Sharif in the north working down in the south. It was really built along those lines. Whereas the units we worked with, once I was out of the ANA, were units that were recruited on a tribal basis. So everyone was from the same tribe, more or less. They were all locally recruited. Now, granted, one of the concerns to that had always been in recruiting in that way was, well, ultimately, that can lead to warlordism, where you really see a feudal security construct. But those units were infinitely more effective than the ANA, because if, Lance Corporal Snuffy is being an idiot. His fire team leader is probably his second cousin, and his second cousin, is going to enforce a level of tribal and familial discipline that you just didn't really have in the ANA. And so seeing that difference was very stark, and it was something that wasn't intuitive to me until I saw it firsthand. But specific to your question, I think a lot remains to be seen. I haven't been to Afghanistan since 2011, though I have many friends who still travel in and out of there. And many of them are actually surprisingly optimistic that the center is going to hold in Afghanistan. And these are people who, I don't count as very Pollyannish. So I think we'll see. I hope so. I think that corruption among the Afghan government has always been rampant. And it's been a huge challenge of the war there, is how to, and I don't know if it's something that you're ever going to necessarily eliminate, but how do you keep it at manageable levels? I think, what they call bakshish is just sort of a part of getting politics and business done. But how do you get it to a point where it's not crippling and paralyzing the government? And I think so much of what we've been trying to do in Afghanistan too, is somewhat anathema to the Afghans, which is they've never really had a strong central government. So how do you work from the top down when the organs of government don't really reach out into the provinces? I think that's a big challenge. I think the corruption is something that also factors into that. But I think when that level of corruption impedes the efficacy of the Afghan government, and that people at the local level where the Taliban are taking root, when you're trying to make the argument you should support the Afghan government, and they say, what has the Afghan government done for me? I don't see any Afghan government here. And the reason they don't is because it's dysfunctional. I think then that really bolsters the Taliban when they can say, look at us, like we're here, we're making things happen. So it's a real challenge, and has been for a while. I think the best thing that happened to Afghanistan is ISIS. And what I mean by that is, the precipitous withdrawal out of Iraq, I believe, was a huge mistake. Not necessarily because I think if there had been 10,000 troops there, U.S. troops, they would have gotten in a line and fought ISIS, but I think it was a very powerful signal to particularly the Sunnis in the region who'd stood up with the U.S. and the coalition during the awakening that the Americans are pulling out of here, that we no longer see this as an area of interest. And so you had the Shia government in Iraq, which was being bolstered by the Iranians, and Maliki's sort of corruption. You had the Kurds in the north, who have always been a little bit on their own program. And the Sunnis basically had no one to ally themselves with, and Maliki's government was really taking them to the ringers. And so that construct left a vacuum, and that vacuum was filled by ISIS. And I think we've all seen that play out. So when I say it's the best thing that ever happened to Afghanistan, I hope, although no one is saying this publicly, the lesson within the administration has been learned that a precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan could leave the same type of political power vacuum where the Afghan government that's left behind really feels like it has nobody backing them up. And whether it's the Afghan Taliban bolstered by the Pakistani Taliban, you would see a very, very rapid descent into chaos in Afghanistan. I don't think we're going to see, and I think current indicators are, that we're not going to see a precipitous withdrawal out of Afghanistan. I think that's probably directly the result of events in Iraq the past year. But I think if you look at Afghanistan, there's always been a tension between the central state and all of the regional powers. And I think the efficacy of a government that works there is understanding how to manage that balance between local power brokers and centralized power brokers. I don't think we got that balance right. I think we put too much credo in the government in Kabul, and not as much power out with the locals. And I think there's always been that tension where the government in Kabul did not want to see the U.S. enabling local power brokers. This is as recently as 3 or 4 years ago when there was like an initiative called the Village Stability Operations Program, which is basically creating local militias, neighborhood watches. And Karzai was wildly against it. He was against it because it was basically empowering, what he was concerned would turn into local warlords. So I think that it's striking that appropriate balance. I don't think we've hit. I think we've probably weighted a little bit too starkly towards Kabul, but it's tough. I'm not turning my nose up to the people who were dealing with those challenges 10 years ago. I think it was a tough bill. I was a White House fellow in 2012 and 13, and if anyone's not familiar with that program, it basically takes early to mid-career professionals and allows them to serve at a senior level in the federal government with the idea that if they make that investment early on in the career, and those people are sort of afforded that access to see how the government works at a higher level, that they will then be more likely later on in their careers to come back. For me, it was really nice because I think there's few times in your life when you're able to really be given a cohort I've used sort of my high school and college days. I was given a cohort of people, the 9 rifle platoon commanders I was with in 1st Battalion, 8th Marines when I was 24 were a cohort. And then, in my early 30s, I was given this great cohort of White House fellows. And it was sort of like a bad joke almost. It'd be like, a nanotechnologist, a Navy SEAL, and a neurosurgeon walk into a room. But in our group, there was a nanotechnologist, a Navy SEAL, and a neurosurgeon. So, that led to a lot of very interesting conversations and people who would really push your boundaries in terms of what you thought. And then throughout the course of that program, usually about twice a week, you would have lunches where they would bring in, amazing speakers, everyone from senior level military officers, all the way up to, getting the chance to have lunch with the president. And you get to have a really frank conversation with those people. So it was an amazing opportunity. After the White House Fellowship, I was actually writing this novel on the side. I had known I wanted to write. My mother is a novelist. I'd grown up around books, with a love of literature. I studied literature and history at Tufts, where I went to school. Going into the wars, I don't know if I knew I would stay as long as I wound up staying. I sort of wound up taking this long 8-year detour. But I always sort of knew I would write about it, although I never had that capacity while I was serving. I was much too close to the events. But shortly thereafter, I decided I wanted to start writing full time. So I did the White House Fellowship, finished this book, and then upon selling this book, a couple of friends of mine were starting a research firm in southern Turkey in a city called Gaziantep, which is about a 40-minute drive from Aleppo. If you're driving the Beltway, you can see the exits to Halep, which is what they call Aleppo. And they basically invited me, said, listen, we're starting this thing up. They'd both been living in Afghanistan for about 7 and 8 years, respectively, working at the American University there. And they said, we're starting this thing up. We're going to be bidding on government contracts, work with NGOs. If you want to come along for the ride, why don't you come? And that sort of gave me my ticket to head down to South Turkey and to have a place to stay in context for being there. And so I started working on what would be my next novel and writing, sort of sending back essays and reportage on what was going on there. And after selling this book and 6 months into that, we just decided to move. So that's what brought me down to South Turkey. I think we're at a little bit of a point of reckoning to what type of country do we want to be? How do we want to be seen abroad? We've just come out of, or in the process of wars, 15 years of war that have been structured in a way wars have never been structured before, in so much as you had the national mobilization of the Second World War, people buying war bonds and a real national call to service, to the draft of the Vietnam War. Each war has its own construct to these wars fought by an all-volunteer military, and funded largely through deficit spending, so there's an increase in taxes so people don't feel them. And as much as right now in the news there seems to be sort of this debate, should we send troops to fight ISIS? I think Senator Graham had remarks for General Dunford the other day to that effect. It's a conversation that kind of really doesn't affect most of the country except for those who are wearing a uniform, and those are all volunteers. And it makes it very easy to go to war. And I'm not going to necessarily say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think we need to talk about it because it definitely bears on who we are as a nation if our path going forward is going to be to fight wars in this way. And I think if we continue fighting them in this way, you'll see 50-year wars. I don't know if that's necessarily who we want to be. So the title of the book, Green on Blue, refers to the ubiquitous insider attacks we've seen in Afghanistan where, green friendly troops, an Afghan will turn his rifle on blue American troops and kill them. So for me, the construct in many respects was to take something which at face value is sort of the most insidious thing that you could do, which is, a betrayal of someone who's trusted you, and to try to peel back the onion on that decision and show it through all of its levels and complexity so that by the time the reader is witnessing this green on blue attack, they might not agree with it, but they at least sort of understand the reduction of motivations. So all the way down, you see how the person who's engaging this attack is presented with this choice and how it makes sense to them. And to me, I think that's just an act of sort of building a bridge and trying to relay the war in a very pragmatic way, as it pertains to Afghans. So in some respects, that was really the book's ambition, was to try to give a glimpse into the war through Afghan eyes, and the inspiration in doing that was trying to render how I thought my friends, the Afghans, saw the war. A huge innovation that happened after I was working with the Afghan National Army is when we paid them over the barrel. So just cash over a barrel, basically. Everyone would come out on payday, and we would pay them out in hard cash. And what inevitably happened was people, commanders would find creative ways to siphon off cash. I mean, one of the best ways to do it was if you had 700 men on, you would make sure to have 700 men on your rolls, even if you only had 550, because you could keep the reciprocal 150 payment slots. But this huge innovation was they're now paid with direct debit. So they set up bank accounts for every soldier, and the soldiers get paid direct debit, which, if you think, is a huge way to cut down on the corruption. Not in every single case, but in the majority in the Afghan National Army. Last time I checked, there was direct debit. Mr. Jack character, again, he comes in and out of the book, and you see him through Aziz's perspective, and Aziz really only has I think one, maybe two direct interactions with him throughout the book, and most of the time he's sort of observing him from a distance. But one of the criticisms that's been levied at some of the Iraq and Afghan war literature that's come out thus far has been this idea that, well, it's very U.S.-centric. It's very focused on the American experience, and the Iraqis or Afghans who appear in these stories really appear as somewhat two-dimensional cutouts and figures, and they're not really fully real. They're not fully realized as characters. I understand that criticism, and some of these writers, are folks who become good friends of mine. But it's also true to the experience is that, for many Americans, if, when I was on my first deployment in Iraq with 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, we weren't doing a lot of work with the Iraqis. And the work we were doing, it wasn't work where we were forming more deep and fully dimensional relationships with these guys. So turning that on its head, now, I'm writing this novel from the Afghan perspective. So how does an Afghan see an American? Do they see them does Aziz see Mr. Jack as this fully realized character who is on his second divorce, but has these 3 children that he loves, and he's still working this job to help out these 3 children, and this is his whole backstory? Aziz doesn't see any of that. What he sees is the guy with blonde hair, blonde beard, who wears sunglasses all the time, who's sort of, keeping things going behind the scenes and is a little bit two-dimensional, and Aziz is a little bit suspicious of. And for me to render that character truly was to think about, there were Afghans I had great relationships with. I mean, obviously my interpreters, many of the commanders and the junior officers I worked with, I like to think, we had real honest friendships that were built out, by serving alongside and fighting alongside one another. But, there's 700 Afghans in some of these units. The PKM gunner from, Alpha Company 2nd Squad, when I walked past, he saw me probably as one of several American advisors who'd rotated through his firebase. I was, there was a wall between us. And so in rendering this Mr. Jack character, I wanted to make sure to do it in a way that was honest. And so a lot of that wall is still there, and Aziz is suspicious of him. Mumtaz was actually an Afghan that I worked with. He was the head of our ammunition. He was basically our ammo tech who ran the stores where we kept all of our weapons. And he was an old Waziri guy with a huge mustache. And oftentimes when I'm writing in early drafts to feel close to my characters, I'll assign them names just of people I know, even if they bear no resemblance to that person. It's almost like a talisman I wrap around a character. And it allows me to feel close to that character in the early drafts. And then inevitably, with the vast majority of them, they take on names of their own and they switch out. But for whatever reason, Mumtaz, if you read the novel, I don't know, for me, it just always stayed. He just stayed Mumtaz. It felt right. So no tie to excellent. Just this one old friend who just stayed in my mind. I think Syria is a failed state now. One of the things that's impacted me the most in observing and writing on the war is is getting to know a lot of the Syrian activists. This is sort of the educated diaspora that was forced to flee the country, but these are the ones who started the revolution in 2011 with very high-minded and democratic ideals. And as we've gotten to, one fellow of my, a friend of mine in particular, a guy named Abed, who used to work at the British consulate, speaks English with a perfect British accent. He, as I got to know him, you can see he feels at the same time such defiance about the cause. The Free Syrian Army is still fighting. We should support this cause, and we should support them. The idea of democracy in Syria cannot die. And then 2 hours later, you can talk to him, and he'll say, I regret the revolution. I wish we'd never done it. I wish we'd left Assad alone. I would still have a home then. That's better than what I have now. And what you see, is someone, him, others, these are people who have basically become ideologically dispossessed. mean, they had a cause, and it was a good cause, and one they believed in, they sacrificed in, and it's pretty much eroded in front of them. But one of the things that's been interesting to me is, as I look back on my war starting in 2003, particularly in the early days, there was a lot of high-minded ideology there. The idea of, could we bring democracy to this part of the world? Could we liberate them from the forces of extremism? And if I look back, I've been dispossessed of that ideology as well. And so as I sit there with a fellow like Abed and we talk, we sip tea or smoke cigarettes late into the night, talking about our wars, we realize that the forces that have dispossessed us of this ideology are in many ways, the forces of radicalism, forces of radical Islam in particular. ISIS is Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I fought against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. ISIS dispossessed his cause. And so in that vein, I'll sit across from a Syrian revolutionary from the early days, and we're actually, in many respects, veterans of the exact same war. The idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So that, to give you one observation that surprised me, that was something I didn't expect to find when I was down there.
Thank you.